Okay, welcome everyone to our second day on the God and Content of our God Business Conference. So, Catherine Pruett, she will present on exclusion and fundamentality. So, without further ado, I think I'll just leave it to Catherine.
Sounds good. Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me to be part of this. I was really sad that I wasn't able to be there in person to hear everybody else's talks and be part of conversations. This is a topic that I've been thinking about for a while, but am trying to write more seriously about just basically right now. So I'm definitely very interested in what all of you have to say. I know that there are a number of people in the room there who have thought very, very hard about the topics that I'm going to be touching on. So very much looking forward to your comments. And here we go. There we go. I remember how to do Zoom. Yay. Okay, so here's what I'm going to be doing today. First off, I'm going to argue that Pratibhishna gives us a metaphysics and a mechanism to understand how fundamental reality, that is non-dual consciousness, could be grounded by subsumption, delimited, could ground by subsumption, delimited subjects and objects as aspects. Okay, so that's a mouthful. But I'm going to kind of take us through a little bit. First, I'm going to introduce the decomposition problem. I feel like pretty much everybody in the room is at least basically familiar, so we'll probably be able to do that relatively quickly. Then I'm going to tell you about where I think Pratibhishna fits into all of this. In terms of like why it is I'm talking about Pratibhishna and decomposition and like what kinds of connections are happening with the contemporary debates. Then I'm going to go into what I think is distinctive. So there's the metaphysics of Pratibhijna in terms of like world creation, and then there's apoha, which means exclusion, as the specific mechanism for that, for creating those worlds. And I think it's the account of apoha in particular that can really add a lot of specificity to debates about the decomposition problem. And then I'm going to just reflect a little bit at the end. All right. So, um, so first off, what is this decomposition problem? So it is also referred to as the decombination problem or the individuation problem. As far as I can tell, these seems to be differences in like preference of terminology. If there are subtle differences between these problems that I haven't caught, I would welcome the audience to definitely tell me what those are. But the basic problem is that if we think that reality is reality, that there's not some kind of like disconnect on a fundamental level in like what is real, then we have the problem of how we go from one fundamental reality to the manifest diversity and multiplicity of our everyday worlds. And this is the problem that is named in these different ways: decomposition, decombination, or individuation problem. It's the problem of how we go from one unitary or non-dual fundamental reality into differentiated experiences. Um, and this is said to be the primary explanatory challenge facing contemporary analytic cosmopsychism. You are also probably at least somewhat familiar with this. Jeff Goff was one of the big people talking about it, but then there's been a lot of really good recent work on South Asian traditions in particular as they interface with this discussion of cosmopsychism. Um, and the reason why this is all very interesting is that if it is the case that we can solve the decomposition problem, then we have a kind of decent handle on at least a productive path towards understanding fundamental reality. Because this is the biggest explanatory challenge offered in relation to a theory that otherwise does a lot of really good things. Okay. All right. So, to say a little bit more about where this debate is lying, there's an important difference between two different forms of panpsychism, micropsychism and cosmopsychism. And I want to delineate these because occasionally they're mixed up a little bit, and occasionally traditions aren't quite pegged into the right camp, and then that can cause a lot of confusion about what exactly is going on. So micropsychism is the idea that fundamental reality is constituted by many particulars whose deep nature is proto-consciousness of some kind. And so then the idea is that this is sort of like atomism, but that the deep nature of the atoms involved are some form of consciousness or proto-consciousness. So somehow the problem is that we have all of these different atoms, and they have to be combined in certain ways in order to get the complex structures that we see in the everyday world. This has lots of problems with the combination side of things. The subject summing problem is one of the big ones, and also the subject irreducibility problems is another big one. One of them is the problem of how you would add up a bunch of little micro or proto perspectives to get a unified perspective. The other one is how you can take a unified perspective and somehow break it down into a bunch of proto perspectives. Both of those seem to be big problems. Cosmopsychism, on the flip side, has been held up by a number of the contemporary defenders of like panpsychic or panpsychic adjacent programs as being the more attractive option here. And this is the idea that I was talking about before, that there's one fundamental individual and it is consciousness or consciousness plus or something that is foundationally related to consciousness. Yeah. And so as defended by Goff, for instance, this is a view that is anti-emergentist, meaning that there is no second entity that emerges that was not already in some way contained or grounded in consciousness itself. It's not subject to combination problems because you don't have little bits that are fundamental. The fundamental entity is the whole. And Goff is going to say it's a form of materialism because it has to do with the deep nature of matter. He is going to say that we can talk about the decombination problem by talking about something that he calls grounding by subsumption. And so grounding by subsumption is unfortunately something that he explores primarily through saying what it's not, and kind of sketching out what it's supposed to do, as opposed to giving a like really specific formulation of what this might be. So first, his basic definition, he says grounding by subsumption is in the first instance a relation between entities. And he says he's using entity in a broad sense. And we can define it as follows. Entity X grounds by subsumption entity Y if and only if 1, X grounds Y, and 2, X is a unity of which Y is an aspect. And he takes unity and aspect to be primitive entities not admitting of more fundamental analysis. And so now a little bit more here on aspects, though, because although they're primitive, it's important to know what they are. So he says, so long as a fundamental entity is structured, it will involve various constituents that can be considered in isolation from the whole, but which are at least contingently dependent for their existence on the whole of which they are constituents. This is precisely what I mean by my talk of aspects. So in my mind, at least, the important thing about this introduction of the idea of grounding by subsumption is that this is a form of grounding that is not a causal grounding. It's not a part whole grounding because it's not mereological and it's not something that has to do with like temporal processes and continuities. So Goff is pointing out that if we're going to solve the decombination problem, we need some kind of account of grounding that lets us understand why something that is fundamentally one would appear in such a way that we completely lose its fundamental oneness without the multiplicity that does appear being anything other than the oneness. And that's what grounding by subsumption is supposed to do. I find this useful in part because Goff is very clear that we need a different kind of grounding to address this problem than a lot of the kind of like standard forms of grounding that will be in play in relation to like different big metaphysical pictures. But then there's the big question of how does this actually work? Like if we think this is a good thing to understand, is there any way that we can get any more specificity about the details? And this is where I'm going to say oops, sorry, that went too far. Okay, there we go. This is where I'm going to say that Pratibhishna can help us. As most of you, or probably all of you in the room probably know, Pratibhishna Shaivism is a particular tradition of non-dual Shaiva tantric philosophy. It traces itself to Somananda in the late 9th century. He wrote the Shiva Drishti. It was systematized by Upala Deva in the early 10th century, who wrote commentaries on the Shiva Drishti and a number of independent works. And then it was further commented on by Abhinavagupta, who wrote commentaries on the Pratibhishna corpus, and also, of course, a gazillion other independent works, as we all know well. This tradition heavily draws, of course, this is also known, on Dharmakirtian Buddhist arguments and like epistemological principles, but it reshapes Dharmakirti's ideas to really different conclusions about the nature of ultimate reality. And this is a lot of the philosophical genius of Upaladeva in particular, is the way that he integrates these very powerful epistemological and metaphysical tools that were developed by Dharmakirti and his successors with a picture of reality that is, of course, totally antithetical to what Dharmakirti himself would want, in that Upaladeva uses Dharmakirti's tools to demonstrate that reality is fundamentally this agentive, willful, creative consciousness, and not the sort of impersonal mere luminosity that Dharmakirti would favor. So some points of contact. So Pratibhajana is not cosmopsychism, but that's partially because it just doesn't, it's totally unclear what it would even mean to say that Pratibhajana is cosmopsychism. There isn't one thing that cosmopsychism is in the contemporary landscape. And there are also some really different things. Like there are different understandings of phenomenal transparency and of conceivability. They're shaped in relation to different concerns and arguments. So like I want to be careful that we don't just squish things together too quickly. But there are some really interesting points of convergence and some affinities that I think at least mean that we can get some tools from Pratibhajana theorists and try to use them in our contemporary conversations as well. One cool thing, though, is that it is explicitly and adamantly not micropsychism. And it's not as common, I feel, to get like a massive smoking gun that can tell us like X historical Sanskrit tradition is not, you know, this other contemporary one. But we actually have that from Somananda with micropsychism. So this is a passage where Somananda is considering an objection, where an objector is trying to say that what's actually fundamental to reality is a whole bunch of little Shiva atoms, and that is all these little Shiva atoms that come together to make things, and it's not the case then that Shiva himself is unitary. I don't think I need to read through all of this for our purposes, but I just wanted to highlight that this is a problem that that Sanskrit theorists were aware of. Like this was a perspective that they were aware of, and it's something that Somananda was very explicit about rejecting. And we will also see that Upaladeva is very explicit about rejecting what would be a micropsychist view as well. And that's partially as the result of his philosophical argumentation, and then also partially as the result of some very famous arguments that he gives. So first off, if we are talking about a multiplicity of like individuated Shiva nature atoms, or atoms of whatever kind you want to say are the micro bits of the micropsychism, then we're talking about something with spatial dimensions for Upaladeva. And as soon as we're talking about something with spatial dimensions, we are not talking about the fundamental form of consciousness. Upaladeva is very clear that spatial sequence and temporal sequence are manifestations of the powers of space and time, and these powers of space and time are actually the first movements of Shiva's power of exclusion, but Shiva himself is not bound by these sequences. So fundamental consciousness is beyond spatial and temporal differentiation. And so like just this idea that we have a whole bunch of differentiated micro bits just is something that Upaladeva rejects on the basis of philosophical argumentation. He also, of course, very famously uses the Vasubandhu style arguments against atomism, and Upaladeva, like Vasubandhu under some later readings, thinks that these arguments would apply to mental atoms just as well as physical atoms. And this is the idea that it doesn't make any sense to say that something without dimensions can aggregate to form something with dimensions. And these are in the beginning of section 1, chapter 5 of the IPK, if anybody wants to check that out. All right, so those were some points of contact, and now we get to get into the actual real fun stuff, which is what is it that Pratibhajana could be contributing to this conversation? And very specifically, is there anything that Pratibhajana can give us that would help us understand grounding by subsumption, since that's like the big sticking point, right? Like if we get that, then we seem to have a good handle on some really interesting things. So I think that Pratibhajana can help. And so what I'm going to do here is try to very quickly set up the metaphysics of world creation in this tradition, because then that's going to be what will allow us to get a handle on Apoha as a mechanism that could account for grounding by subsumption. So here, first off, and again, I apologize if this is all review to those of you in the room. In Pratibhijna traditions, ultimate reality is Shiva. Shiva here is a technical term. It does, of course, mean the god Shiva, but it also means a lot more than that, because there is nothing that is not encompassed by Shiva in this sense. Because Shiva is consciousness as the infinite variegation, able to express itself as any and all manifest worlds. Then, in addition to Shiva, what Shiva does when he manifests these worlds is he creates conventional realities. And these are embodied worlds created through the exclusion of subject and object. And these worlds manifest just because the ultimate desires to experience itself in diverse forms. This desire and this creativity are absolutely crucial. So the root metaphor that runs throughout pretty much the entirety of the Pratibhijna corpus is the idea of Shiva as an artist. And so we can see here, even in in Upaladeva's benedictory verse, there we go, sorry. At the beginning of his commentary on the Shiva Drishti, he says, homage to the three-eyed Shiva, the source of the generation of all marvelous things, the one who creates the portrait of the universe on his own body, which is made of the ether of consciousness. So like right at the beginning, when Upaladeva, in like a very like advanced moment, he wrote his commentary on the Shiva Drishti after all of his Pratibhijna works, is figuring out like, what am I going to say in a nutshell to try to present our tradition? This is what we get. We get an image of Shiva as an artist. One of my favorite verses in all of like Sanskrit is something that Abhinavagupta writes at the beginning of the chapter on Apoha in section 1 of the IPK. And he says, we praise Shiva, the sculptor of variety, who by his mere will, using the chisel of exclusion, carves out objective entities, which are the mass that is not different from his own self. So here again, when we have the chapter on like outlining the mechanism that Shiva is going to use to create these worlds, the metaphor here is an artistic metaphor again, and it's actually not even a metaphor we're going to see. All right, so this is a little bit of a crazy slide. This is my attempt to try to give a picture of what's happening in world creation for Pratibhijna so that we can get a little more of a handle on what this grounding by subsumption might look like. So I think the best way to think about worlds in Pratibhijna is in terms of a topographic map. So topographic maps, if you can see my mouse or just look at this thing on the right here, characteristically are present themselves as these like series of lines where enclosed figures represent higher altitudes and then larger concentric or adjoining figures represent the contours of various types of land masses. So you can see this central picture, we have like two different mountain peaks, and we have also the fact that the topographic map itself is a perspective from above. It's an aerial perspective, so space and time are not explicitly visible from the perspective of the topographic map, but they are the implied structures that allow the map to have the structure that it does. And what that aerial view maps is the same as the base view. So if you were looking from straight above and looking down and see all of these different figures, then what you're seeing is a map of the way that space and time shape land masses, where it's the perspective that allows us to see how those land masses interconnect. And so the sky here is time and space. And the thing that I find really useful about this metaphor is that it allows us to see how even though it appears as if worlds are limited and not connected from each other, they are all actually continuous. And so we can descend mountains or we can climb mountains. And when we're climbing, we're getting into smaller worlds that seem to be cut off from more of everything else. They afford fewer possibilities for movement on the basis of the land masses they're part of. But that kind of division is something that's possible only because those worlds are little slivers of a much larger underlying reality. And at the ground, this larger reality encompasses all of the possible land masses. And so they are all actually connected, even though that connection is not visible from various points on a given mass itself. So then here's how all of this would work out when we're thinking about the process of actually creating a differentiated world. This slide is also color-coded. So here, anything that is written in red is designating a subject, in blue, an object, and purple is non-dual awareness, and green is a POHA. So let me first explain the red, blue, purple. If we have a purple blob, like look at the purple blob in front of you there, it just looks like a purple blob. It looks like one thing, but it is part of the nature of purple that if we were to take this purple and draw out from it the aspects of it that are red, what that would do is by necessity draw out also the aspects of the purple that are blue, because the red and the blue together are what can mix to create the purple. The purple by nature can polarize itself and show up as red and blue. Interestingly, when it does that, when purple shows up as red and blue, the purple itself vanishes. And it vanishes even though it's still there. But its mode of presentation as what has been like created through exclusion, when we have this red that is necessarily set off from blue, the blue that is necessarily set off from red, we end up with something that masks its underlying unity in its presentation of itself as mutual exclusive difference. So that's why we're using those particular color codes there. So the idea is that the base of reality, reality itself, the base of the landmass, is this purple. It's Shiva's non-dual awareness. And this non-dual awareness has the capacity to manifest as any and all differentiated worlds. And the first moment of its doing this is just this mere polarization into red and blue, just like the mere emergence of a subject-object structure. But then that subject-object structure can be further narrowed and refined and made more and more determinate by excluding more and more and more of the other possibilities for how it can manifest. So this is like moving up the mountain. So we go from the base of the landmass, the entirety of everything, the purple, to an initial movement up a little bit where there's still so many different possibilities that really what's salient is just the mere division into subject and object, to increasingly specific worlds. And our worlds are like somewhere up there in sort of like the middle to the top, not all the way to the top, but like, you know, where we already inhabit really quite restricted worlds as humans sharing this common intersubjective world. And so that's what this middle part here is representing. So you can see a little bit that the person who is holding this woman's hand, he's wearing a red shirt. And so like the red there is the subject perspective on this. Interestingly, from the subject's perspective within the world, the subject perspective also disappears. So what we see in the world is objects, even though our world is actually jointly constituted by like the subject position that looks out at these objects. So that's why we have here the artist's waking world, which I'll get to the artist, is already itself constituted by this mutually exclusive appearance of subject and object. The way that we get from Shiva's non-dual awareness to anyone's waking world is through an artistic process that Shiva performs, which delimits aspects of himself through excluding some possible worlds via restrictions in space and time. And so there's some wonderful work by Isabelle Ratier on Upaladeva on the power of action. And this goes through how it is that Upaladeva sees the different forms of difference that are spatial sequence and temporal sequence working together to actually create determinate worlds. And so basically the idea is that temporal sequence is a difference in unity, and spatial sequence is mutually exclusive difference. And it's when we get those two different forms of difference together that we have action, and then that allows us to have like entities that are able to change over time while still being the entities that they are. And Apoha is what does that on a fundamental level, because Apoha just is the Shiva's power of creating distinctions through exclusion. So basically, something shows up as what it is because of the way that it has been separated off from what it is not. So that basic process creates any given world. It's the same process that we, if we were to engage in artistic creation, would tap into in our world. And so from within a particular delimited world, an artist can tap into these same powers of exclusion to craft even more specific, even more determinate worlds that then foreground certain particular experiences so that they can then be appreciated through aesthetic commonization, which would then actually allow a spectator to knock back down into deeper levels of reality. So I brought this up in relation to artistic creation within the conventional world as well, to really try to make the point that the mechanism here that is responsible for world creation full stop is not that special. It's the same mechanism that anyone uses at any moment of their life to like parse and divide up any kind of determinate reality. And it's the same mechanism that we can see how it functions to create different realities when we engage in imagination and artistic creation and other forms that allow us to shift levels of reality. Okay, so that's how that works in a nutshell. And all of this carving is how Shiva creates worlds. This is a verse coming from the end of the chapter on Apoha in the Ishwar Pratibhishan Karikas. And so this famous verse, thus also in the course of ordinary reality, the Lord entering the body, etc., renders externally manifest by his volition the multitude of objects that shine within him. And so this idea is that like these, red, blue, polarized subject object structured worlds, which appear to be totally distinct, are in fact just a particular exercise of exclusion that Shiva has performed on himself, and that is what creates a world. Okay, so a couple more little pieces here, and then I'll finish up. So one of the things that this gives us is a really clear way of thinking about the distinction between awareness as such, so like awareness as fundamental reality, and what I'm going to call subjectivity, which is just like the subject aspect of a subject-object duality. So Abhinavagupta is really fantastic, following Upaladeva, of course, at being very, very clear in distinguishing these two things. And so, as Abhinava says, the realization which occurs in relation to the self is of manifestation. So that's the ultimate aham pratibhamarsha. It is neither the this of the object to be known, like blue, etc., nor the I in relation to the conceptualized knowing subject, like in the body, etc. So the idea here is that this is just Abhinava's statement that the purple is different from the red. So the purple, awareness as fundamental reality, is that which has the potential to manifest any and all possible subject-object structured world. Neither the subject aspects nor the object aspects are more essential to that purple than the other is. They are both equally delimitations of awareness. And so like it is not right to say for Pratibhishan Shaivas that subjectivity in my terminology is at the core of reality. Awareness is at the core of reality. Subjectivity and objectivity are equally delimitations of awareness. And then the second passage here is actually from the Malini Shloka Vartika. And this is just a lovely little bit that also unfolds the Apoha as the mechanism into it. So Abhinava here says, within non-dual reality, difference is also not possible. So non-dual reality is something that it cannot be reduced to any assertion of its being one, if by one you mean it is exclusive of any difference. Indeed, Abhinava says, this ultimate non-duality is not the grasping or rejection of difference. However, within difference, because all things are delimited in their own inherent nature, I think that this word non-different will become differentiated naturally. Super cool thing here is that this phrase, because all things are delimited in their own inherent nature, is a quotation from Dharmakirti. This is from the verses in Dharmakirti's Svavriti on his Pramanavartika, where he first launches into his discussion of apoha. And their Dharmakirti's point is that since all things are delimited in their own inherent nature, since everything is unique, then we can actually create through exclusion classes entities that are not tautological. So we can have universals that function in certain ways in inferences without collapsing all word meanings into everything else, because when you have an infinite sea of completely unique particulars, then when you like suppress any subset of those particulars, what you are left with, although it doesn't have any essential nature, is still different from what would have happened if you had suppressed any other particular subset. But Abhinav, of course, flips this on his head there. Instead, he's pointing out that this mechanism of exclusion, this idea that we create what appear to be mutually exclusive differences, functions not in relation to a sea of infinite particulars, but rather in relation to something that has the capacity to arise as anything at all. And so the oneness of fundamental reality, it consists in the fact that it is productive of all possible differences. It is not exclusive of differences. And the mechanism that allows us to produce these differences is apoha, is the fact that aspects of ultimate reality can be delimited, so that the ultimate forgets its own totality and instead is able to treat these differences as real. All right, just a few key implications and then I will be done. So a few of them, this first one is actually pretty big. Subjects and objects do not emerge because nothing new is formed. And this is really great because we don't have to solve emergence problems, which are a mess. And so if we don't have to mess with those, that's a very good thing for us. And you can think about this again in terms of the purple and the red and the blue. When we split purple into red and blue, we haven't created anything new. The red and the blue were always there. They've always, like, purple is always constituted by red and blue, but it's a particular filter or process that we have applied to the purple that allows it to appear as what it is not. And this is what consciousness does. Consciousness is that which is able to appear as what it is not without losing its own inherent nature. That's Upaladeva's big thing about consciousness. And so since nothing new here is formed, we don't need to account for like how something new emerges. We don't need to worry about supervenience. We don't need to worry about reduction. We don't need to worry about any of that stuff. That's just not the way this grounding by subsumption relation would work. So instead, subject and object are aspects of consciousness that appear as determinate via exclusion, merely by ignoring the possibilities that they could have manifest otherwise. And then again, determinate subjects are just as much exclusions as are determinate objects. And so we have this difference between subjectivity and awareness, such that we can say that awareness, not subjectivity, is in fact fundamental. So then, just to restate the conclusion, so Pratyabhijna, I think, gives us a metaphysics and a mechanism to understand how a fundamental reality that is non-dual consciousness could ground by subsumption delimited subjects and objects as its aspects. Okay, so I'm going to stop screen share so I can see y'all a little better. And thank you.